Did you know that Luxray's ability Intimidating Fang can prevent you from hurting yourself? Welcome back to another TCG Pocket video, it's Brovini here. In this video, I've set up a series of tests under different situations to test how this ability works. Take this situation for example, my Giratina is on 10 health. Under normal circumstances, its attack would do 20 damage to myself and I would lose this Giratina. But with Luxray on the field, on the opponent's side, what do you think will happen to my Giratina when I make this attack Chaotic Impact? This Pokemon does 20 damage to itself. And here is another very interesting scenario, Alolan Sandslash. When you use this attack, the next turn when your opponent attacks Alolan Sandslash, they will receive 40 damage. But if your opponent is Luxray, who has Intimidating Fang, who would normally minus 20 on the attack damage, would that counter attack damage also be reduced? I mean, it's not even an attack, it's a counter attack that didn't even happen on your own turn. Does Intimidating Fang apply outside of your attack on your turn? And to begin with, what even is self-inflicted damage? Is it considered an attack, or is it part of the effect of an attack, which is actually different? In case you didn't know, some cards will specify that it will prevent all damage and effects of attacks, whereas some cards just say prevent all damage but doesn't prevent effects of attacks. So what is effects of attack? We know effects of attack are things like poison, but what about counter-attack damage like Alolan Sandslash? What about just self-inflicted damage? I'm going to try and answer all of those questions in this video, starting with a pretty simple scenario, Giratina versus Oricorio. Probably a more commonly seen situation in the current and previous meta. Scenario number 1, Oricorio versus Giratina EX. Giratina EX will do 0 damage because it's an EX Pokemon on Oricorio because of its ability Safeguard. But in doing 0 damage, does that mean its own self-inflicted damage, the 20 damage, would also be negated? If you want to take a guess, now's the time to pause the video. So this is the outcome. Chaotic Impact doesn't do damage to Oricorio, but Giratina does hurt itself. Well, I guess it makes sense because Oricorio's ability says that all damage done to Oricorio by EX Pokemon is negated, is 0. It doesn't say that Pokemon's self-inflicted damage would be 0. So any damage outside of what's done to Oricorio sensibly would still happen. But while we're here, let's add one more layer to this. If I give Helmet to Oricorio and Giratina makes another attack, does Giratina take 40 damage or only 20 in total? Once again, this is where you should pause the video if you want to take a guess. Giratina makes this attack, takes 20 damage, but does not take Helmet damage. And I guess that still makes sense because if you read the card text, Helmet says that it will do that counter damage only if damage is done to the Pokemon it's attached to. Even if an attack is made, if it's 0 damage, then Helmet doesn't activate. Now, what if the situation didn't involve an ability? What if the output of the attack becomes 0 damage due to effects other than an ability? Will this self-inflicted damage still apply? So here I've set up a different situation where I use blue and Beast Wall so that Poipole, my Ultra Beast, takes minus 30 damage in the next turn. The opponent's Litten attack will do 30 less, making its damage output to be 0, but will Litten's self-inflicted damage still apply? So pause again if you want to guess. And here is the outcome. 0 damage is done to Poipole, but Litten does take 10 damage. And I guess that makes sense because both cards, Blue and Beast Wall, they say that your Pokemon will take a certain amount of damage less in the next turn. It doesn't say that your opponent will take less damage. But what about this situation? This is Shinx, who can prevent all damage and effects of attacks done to Shinx. Do you think Litten will harm itself with the self-inflicted damage if all damage and effects are negated? To be fair, it does say that it's negated if it's done to Shinx. So here I flip ahead, and as you can see it says prevents all damage and effects of attacks. And Litten makes his move. Yes, Litten still takes that 10 damage. So that was the easy part of the video. You probably could have predicted some of those outcomes. Now we're going to look at something a little more interesting. What will happen when Luxray goes up against Giratina EX? Here my Giratina is on 10 health. If I make an attack, normally I would lose that Giratina and my opponent would get 2 win points. But with Luxray's ability, Intimidating Fang, my chaotic impact, instead of doing 130, now does 110 on the attack output. As it says here, attacks do minus 20 damage. This is my Giratina's effects list. And it even tells you 130 becomes 110 with a down arrow. It still says this Pokemon also does 20 damage to itself. Or does it? Let me know what you guys think of this outcome. So Giratina makes the attack and does 0 damage to itself. Turns out Luxray protected my Giratina. So hang on a sec, let's analyze the situation. Let's read Luxray's ability again. It says as long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, attacks used by your opponent's active Pokemon do minus 20 damage. It doesn't say where that minus 20 applies. It's simply that all attack damage by the opponent up against Luxray will do minus 20 damage, and therefore it includes self-inflicted damage. There aren't many Pokemon with this ability currently, and I think Luxray might be the only one, so this is not a commonly seen scenario, and therefore may not be that well known. And to be fair, the ability Intimidate in the core series game also does something similar. It reduces your opponent's attack, and therefore any self-inflicted damage like from confusion would be reduced as well. So it's not that surprising if you consider that it's just like the core series game Intimidate. Conversely, if the attack were raised, for example if you use Swagger in the core series game and you hurt yourself in your confusion, the confusion damage actually does more as well because it's relative to your attack. And as it turns out, this is not new. The same ability, Intimidating Fang, existed in Sandile from the physical TCG, from the set Unbroken Bonds. According to Ruling's Compendium, Sandile's Intimidating Fang reduces all damage done by the opponent's active Pokemon. That includes your defending Pokemon, your bench Pokemon, and even damage done to your opponent's own Pokemon. Wait, does that mean your opponent's bench Pokemon would also take less damage? Let's take a look. Here I've got Zapdos who does 30 damage to its own benched Pokemon, but I've got Luxray on the other side. Naturally its attack is reduced from 100 to 80 because of the ability, which you would have expected, but have a look at this. The bench damage also goes down from 30 to 10. So in actual fact, Luxray reduces all damage output from your opponent's Pokemon attacks, but it doesn't apply to abilities. As you can see here with Greninja's ability, Luxray does not prevent that 20 damage, but of course with its regular attack, it does get reduced by 20. And yes, Luxray's ability also activates when your opponent attacks your bench, not just their own bench. So take a look at this. Raichu here does 60 damage minus 20 to Luxray, and then does 0 damage to Shinx because it's minus 20 per Pokemon. It seems like the text that defines self-inflicted damage, like on Giratina, is part of an attack, not the effect of attack. So based on that understanding, Luxray shouldn't be able to prevent itself from Rocky Helmet or Druddigon. So here I've got Rocky Helmet on Giratina and Luxray is going to make an attack. Since Luxray's ability is reducing the attack of the opponent's Pokemon, it still takes 20 damage from Helmet. And it's just the same with Druddigon with its Rough Skin ability. When Luxray makes an attack, Luxray's ability doesn't reduce that counter damage. But knowing that may have misled you to think what might happen against Alolan Sandslash. Take a look at Alolan Sandslash. During your opponent's next turn, if this Pokemon is damaged by an attack, do 40 damage to the attacking Pokemon. What do you think happens when Luxray makes an attack on Alolan Sandslash after Alolan Sandslash has used this attack? So here Sandslash uses the Spike Armor, does 20 damage, but of course it becomes 0 because of Luxray's ability. It appears the effect of attack still activated, even though it did 0 damage, because you can see in the effects list that the effect is right here, 40 damage to the attacking Pokemon. Now this comes under effects according to the game, so the game told us this. And just a reminder, quite literally, Luxray's ability says attacks used by your opponent's Pokemon, not effects of attacks. So now, what do you think happens when Luxray attacks Sandslash, gets a counter attack damage? Will it take 40 or will it take 20 counter attack damage? I recommend you pause the video at this point because the result could surprise you. So here is the outcome, 90 damage to Sandslash and only 20 to Luxray. That is different to Helmet and Druddigon that we tested just a second ago. And according to the game, that was an effect of attack, not an attack on its own. So is this a bug again, or is this intended? What do you guys think? And finally, I want to show you two more tests. This one is for Rampardos. Rampardos has a slightly different text to Giratina. Giratina simply does 20 damage to itself. If Luxray is on your opponent's side, then it does 0. For Rampardos, if your opponent's Pokemon is knocked out by damage from this attack, this Pokemon does 50 damage to itself, so Rampardos will take 50 damage. That in itself sounds more like an effect of attack than an attack itself, but no matter, let's assume that it is just the attack. Should Rampardos take 30 damage or 50 damage if it takes out Luxray? Think about that for a moment, because Luxray's ability will dissipate when it's knocked out. But which one will apply first? Will the fact that Luxray is no longer in the active spot be applied and then 50 damage is done to Rampardos? Or will Luxray, its ability be applied before it gets knocked out so that Rampardos will take less damage? Again, pause the video, have a think about it, let me know what you guys think. So this is the outcome. My Rampardos does 110 damage, plus weakness, so it's 130, knocks out the opponent. Rampardos takes only 30 damage from knocking out Luxray. Some of you may have guessed this correctly, but had we not tested, I'm not sure we could have been confident to know the answer. And the last test, and this just happens to be a side test I did just to confirm my understanding of this game. This isn't related to Luxray, but I wanted to know if I use Melmetal's ability, Hard Coat, which allows it to take 20 less damage, but the damage comes from your own Pokemon, whether it would still take 20 less damage. So let's take a look. This is obviously not a common deck. Metal and Lightning is not commonly seen, so it may not be common knowledge what would happen here. Zapdos does 100 damage to my opponent, 30 damage to one of my benched, but my benched Melmetal has an ability that protects it from 20 damage. And it indeed does still work, even if the damage comes from your own Pokemon. So Melmetal only took 10 damage as opposed to 30 damage. So I leave you with one question at the end of this video. What do you guys think is considered effects of attack? Going back to the Alolan Sandslash attack, after using Spike Armor, the 40 counter damage is under effects list. Yet, Luxray only took 20 from the 40 damage, when Luxray's ability is about the attack of your opponent's Pokemon, not about the effects of attack. And if we were to use the core series understanding of how this works, Spike Armor sounds more like a defensive thing rather than an offensive thing. So Spike Armor's ability to deal damage shouldn't depend on the attack stats of Alolan Sandslash. Thank you for watching, guys. Hopefully you guys found this video helpful, and now you know what you didn't know you didn't know. So it turns out Pokemon was right. Basic reading ability is indeed needed to fully enjoy the game, as long as it's not bugged.